What's up guys, it's River and today we're talking about the best budget Canon cameras. By the way, if you're new to the channel, we talk about anything and everything to do with cameras, plus teaching you guys how to take better photos and videos. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more of this content. And as always, I'm going to leave links down below for all of the products that we talk about today, so be sure to check that out. Let's get into the video. The first camera on the list is the Canon T7. It is the world's most popular DSLR because it is also the world's most affordable DSLR. And despite being a budget camera, it still delivers rock solid performance. This camera has a 24 megapixel sensor, which is pretty great to have at this price point. You're going to get very high resolution photos and nice sharp video with this sensor. In terms of photos, it does 3 frames per second, which is a little bit slow, but for the kind of user that's going to be using this camera, they're probably not going to be shooting anything that's moving too fast. If you're shooting things like landscapes, parties, just your everyday life, you will have no issues. But if you're shooting something with a lot of movement or action, your camera will struggle to keep up. And despite this being a budget camera, it still has 14-bit RAW. So when it comes to editing your photos in Photoshop, Lightroom, or just on your phone, you will have a ton of flexibility. If you know how to use your camera right, you can get very close to pro results with this camera. And one of the things that really sets this camera apart are the colors. The colors out of any Canon cameras simply look amazing. The colors are deeply saturated and they really don't need much editing, but what really sets the Canon cameras apart are the skin tones. Basically, everybody looks attractive because Canon cameras treat skin tones really well. Everybody has this healthy glow to them, and when it comes to shooting everyday people, one of the first things that you'll notice about photos that make people look good and not look good is how their skin looks on camera. So naturally, let's talk about video in this camera. It does full HD up to 30 frames per second, and this video is going to look sharp and crisp. However, it also does 720p at 60 frames per second, so you will get 2x slow motion at 720p resolution. However, there is no 4K. But one thing that I do have to mention when it comes to the Canon T7 is the autofocus. When it comes to photos, the autofocus is amazing. It's fast and reliable, but when it comes to video, the autofocus is pretty unusable and it kind of just falls apart. That's because the autofocusing system for photos is entirely different than the one for videos. You can do video in a pinch, but this is really a camera that's made for photos and photos on a budget. If you want to do video, it's there, but it's really not going to do a great job at it, mainly because of the autofocus issues. And last but not least, let's talk about design, because when it comes to Canon cameras, the design is nearly flawless. The ergonomics on this camera are amazing. All the buttons are exactly where you need them. It's super easy to figure out. The menus are simple and straightforward. If you've never used a camera or you're not that experienced with cameras, this camera is going to be really easy to just pick up and get great results with. However, there's 2 issues that I do have when it comes to the physical design of this camera. Now, the camera is well built, it's nice and robust, feels great in your hands, it's gonna last you forever, but it doesn't have an audio jack, so you can't plug in an external mic, and the internal audio is pretty trash. But on top of that, the screen at the back of the camera is fixed, so if you're trying to do high angle shots, low angle shots, it's gonna be a bit of a struggle, and if you're trying to record yourself, good luck, because whatever the camera has is what it has. It's really hard to film yourself with this camera. This is really a camera where you're shooting the world, not really shooting yourself. But if you are somebody that wants an articulating screen or is going to be shooting themselves a lot, I have a camera specifically for you later in this list, so don't go anywhere. Also guys, if you're enjoying these videos so far and you want to see more camera reviews by Indian Keanu Reeves, make sure to leave a like on this video. It helps me and Keanu Reeves out. And the next camera on the list is made for someone that wants a great photo and video experience with spectacular autofocus, but they don't want a big, bulky camera to carry around. They want something nice and compact that fits into their pocket. For you guys, I have the Canon G9X Mark II. The G9X is really a point-and-shoot camera, but where most point-and-shoot cameras look like absolute hot garbage, the G9X actually looks really good because it's a Canon. The G9X does have a small 1-inch sensor, but unless you're going to be doing professional work, you're really not going to notice it. What is interesting is that this camera has a 20 megapixel sensor with a built-in lens from 24mm to 84mm. That zoom range is going to give you a wide shot and a close-up shot all in one lens without having to buy anything extra. And the autofocus in this camera is amazing. It's easy to use. It actually has touch controls on the back to select your autofocus points, but overall it's fast and reliable in both photos and video. When it comes to photos, this camera shoots 8 frames per second up to 30 frames at a time, so you can take 30 photos before this camera needs a breather. And just like the last camera, it also does 14-bit RAW, so you are going to have a ton of flexibility when it comes to editing your photos in Lightroom or Photoshop. When it comes to video, the performance train continues. It does full HD up to 60 frames per second with amazing autofocus. Sadly, it does not have 120 frames per second at full HD, which is 4 times slow motion, and it does not have 4K. But if you are somebody that wants those features, I do recommend looking into something that's slightly more expensive, like the G7X Mark III or the G7X Mark II. The G7X Mark II and Mark III are more expensive, but you get a flip-up screen with an audio jack, which leads me to be the bearer of bad news. The two things I don't like about this camera is that there is no flip-up screen to see yourself, and unfortunately there is no audio jack. But once again, this is really meant to be a budget camera for someone that's shooting other things and not necessarily themselves. And before I forget, just like every other Canon camera, the G9X still has those spectacular Canon colors. So no matter what you shoot on this camera, it's going to look good. So if you've made it this far into the video, I know what you're looking for. You want a high resolution camera with horsepower that you can use to shoot yourself with. Well, I have the camera for you, my friend, and that is the Canon M200. The M200 is really meant to be a lifestyle camera and an everyday driver. This is a camera that you take with you everywhere you go, and it's specifically designed to be small and compact to fit into a purse, a jacket pocket, or even a front pocket. This camera has a 24 megapixel sensor, which is pretty standard in almost every Canon camera. And when it comes to photos, it does 6.1 frames per second in 14-bit RAW. Personally, I think that's a little bit slow, but for the kind of person this camera is meant for, you guys will not notice it. I wouldn't recommend this camera for sports or something with a lot of action, but for someone that's just using this to capture their everyday life, 6.1 frames per second is more than fast enough. When it comes to video, it does full HD up to 60 frames per second, which is 2 times slow motion, and 120 frames per second at 720p, which is 4 times slow motion. And in case you're wondering, it does do 24 and 30 frames per second for everyday real-time filming. Now the M200 does have 4K, but it's not really ideal. It does 4K at 24 frames per second. However, when you go into 4K mode, it crops into your sensor by 1.7 times, which basically means it zooms into all of your lenses, which kind of messes up the wide shot, but you do get a little bit of extra closeness on your close-up or telephoto shots. However, when you go into 4K mode, it's not particularly sharp or detailed simply because you're throwing away half of your sensor, half of your megapixels, and therefore the quality just lacks. I don't think the M200 is a good 4K camera, and I wouldn't get it specifically for the 4K mode. And I know I said the previous camera had really good autofocus, but when it comes to the autofocus in the M200, it is on another level. The M200 has Canon's very popular dual pixel autofocus, which is very, very good. It has intelligent face tracking and object tracking, and when you're looking at someone's face close up, it even does eye tracking. So when it comes to autofocus, it's almost set it and forget it. It's actually kind of hard to mess up a photo. And thankfully, the dual pixel autofocus also works just as well for video. The video in this camera is sharp, fast, clean, and the autofocus definitely holds up. But the camera isn't perfect, so let's talk about design. When it comes to design, Canon specifically made this camera to be slim and compact. It's thin and can easily fit into your purse or jacket pocket. And one thing that I appreciate is that they were able to incorporate a flip-up screen so that you can see yourself, which is super handy. And while I do love that they included a flip-up screen in such a slim design, it's only really usable if you're recording yourself or you're doing something that's a low angle or hip level shot. If you're doing something that's a high angle shot, you'll still have the same struggles with a fixed screen. Now this camera does not have any input for external audio, but that's okay, because it's really not made for someone that's trying to do professional or semi-professional work. It's really made for someone that's on the go, just wants to vlog, and for that reason, the internal audio on this camera is really solid. It is kind of tinny or kind of scratchy if you're too far away from the camera, but if you're close to the camera talking to it, the audio is super solid. But other than that, the ergonomics on this camera are fantastic. Buttons are very minimal. However, Canon really made this to be a touchscreen camera. Everything you need to do can easily be accessed through the touchscreen on the back of this camera. If you can use a smartphone, you will be able to use this camera with ease. Everything you need is right there on the front menu, and it's really easy to figure out. But chances are this is either your first camera or you're interested in improving the quality of your photos and videos. In that case, I highly recommend checking out the Camera Boost course in the link down below. In this course, I'm going to show you how to take your $500 beginner camera and make it perform like a $3,000 professional camera. Because here's what no one tells you. You don't need fancy gear or lighting to get great results. What you actually need are skills and knowledge. So in this course, I'm going to show you everything you need to know, from shooting, composing, proper editing techniques, and how to do lighting on a budget. So if you're interested in taking your photos and videos to the next level, check out the Camera Boost course in the link down below, and I'll see you in the course. Alright guys, and that brings us to the final camera. It's actually a really popular camera, and that is the Canon M50. Now the Canon M50 is specifically for somebody that wants a budget camera, but also wants to do some serious or semi-professional work with their camera. When it comes to specs, it's pretty close to the Canon M200, but with a few upgrades. In terms of the sensor, it's exactly the same at 24 megapixel sensor, but when it comes to photos, at 14-bit RAW, it actually does 10 frames per second, and for videos, it does exactly the same video frame rates. It does full HD at 60 frames per second, 120 frames per second at 720p, and 4K at 24 frames per second, but sadly, with that massive 1.7 crop. Again, I don't think the M200 is a 4K camera, and I still don't think the M50 is a 4K camera. Thankfully, much like the M200, the M50 also has dual pixel autofocus, which is spectacular in both photos and videos. One thing that I should mention is that in 4K mode, dual pixel autofocus is turned off. That mode simply requires way too much processing power, and you have contrast-based autofocus in 4K mode, which is not as fast and not as reliable. So you might be asking yourself, why should I get the M50 over the M200? Because the M200 is slightly cheaper. Well, with the M50, you have two major benefits. The first reason is having an articulating screen on the side of the camera has much more usability than a flip screen on the top of the camera. Having 360-degree movement on the side is going to give you a lot more viewing angles, and overall, it's much easier to use. By placing the screen on the side of the camera, you're going to be able to put a microphone on top of the camera for better external audio. Which actually brings me to my second point. The M50 has input for an external audio mic, which is going to be a must for anybody that wants to do semi-serious or semi-professional work with this camera. Overall, the only downside of the M50 is the 4K crop. Other than that, it's a great first camera, or a great camera to get started with if you're looking to do something semi-serious or semi-professional. Well guys, that's pretty much it for this video. Let me know in the comments down below what camera you guys are thinking of picking up. And once again, if you want to take your photos and videos to the next level, make sure to check out the Side Hustle Pro course in the link down below, and I will either see you in the course or in the next video. Peace.